There is a woman in the historical record, not in legend, not in mythology, in the actual documented historical record, who led one of the earliest Christian communities. She is mentioned by name in the New Testament. Paul calls her his co-worker. He places her name before his own in his greeting. You have almost certainly never heard a sermon about her. There is another woman who, by the account of the Gospels themselves, was the first human being to witness the resurrection, the first person Jesus appeared to after he rose, the person he specifically chose to carry that news to the apostles. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, she was called the apostle to the apostles. Then something changed. She became a prostitute in a sermon delivered by a pope in 591 AD with no scriptural basis whatsoever. That characterization stood as official Catholic doctrine for almost 1,400 years. It was not formally corrected until 1969. These are not the only 2. There are women woven through the earliest fabric of every major religion, women who led, who taught, who funded, who founded, whose names appear in the oldest texts and then quietly disappear from the version of the story most people are handed. Today, we go looking for them. Let's start with the most famous misrepresentation in Christian history, Mary Magdalene. Here is what the canonical Gospels actually say about her, not what tradition says, not what centuries of painting and sermon have layered on top, what the text itself says. She was present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled. She was present at the burial. She was the first person at the empty tomb on the morning of the resurrection. She was the first person the risen Jesus appeared to, and Jesus specifically instructed her to go and tell the disciples what she had seen. In the Gospel of John, the risen Jesus speaks his first post-resurrection words not to Peter, not to John, not to any of the 12. He speaks them to Mary Magdalene. By the internal logic of the Gospels themselves, the resurrection, the central event of the entire Christian faith, was first witnessed, first received, and first proclaimed by a woman. That is not a feminist reinterpretation. That is what the text says. If you grew up in church, how was Mary Magdalene presented to you? Because I think the answer says something interesting about how we receive information we've never been asked to question. Now here is what the text does not say. It does not say she was a prostitute. It does not say she was a sinner of a sexual nature. It does not say she was the woman caught in adultery. It does not say she was the unnamed woman who washed Jesus' feet. Those are 4 separate people in the Gospels. They were collapsed into a single composite figure, Mary Magdalene, the repentant prostitute, in a sermon preached by Pope Gregory I in 591 AD. Gregory had no scriptural basis for that identification. He said so himself in the sermon. He was offering an interpretation, not a reading of the text. But the interpretation stuck. For 1,400 years, it defined how the Western Church understood and presented the woman the Gospels name as the first witness to the resurrection. The Vatican formally acknowledged the error in 1969. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated her feast day to the same liturgical rank as the Apostles, officially recognizing her as what the early Church had called her, Apostle to the Apostles. 1,400 years. For a misidentification in a single sermon. Most people have never heard the name Junia. She appears once in the New Testament, in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 7. Paul writes, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." Outstanding among the apostles, in Christ before Paul. That is Paul, the author of a significant portion of the New Testament, describing a woman named Junia as a prominent apostle who was a Christian before he was. For the first 12 centuries of Christianity, Everyone who read that verse understood Junia to be a woman. The early church fathers, Origen, Jerome, John Chrysostom, all referred to Junia as female and celebrated her accordingly. John Chrysostom wrote in the 4th century, "Oh, how great is the devotion of this woman, that she should be even counted worthy of the appellation of apostle." Then in the 13th century, something shifted. A scholar named Giles of Rome began referring to Junia as Junius, a male name. His reasoning was essentially circular. A woman could not be an apostle. Therefore, the person Paul called an apostle must have been a man. Therefore, Junia was Junias. The male name Junius does not appear anywhere in the historical record outside this verse. It has never been found in any ancient document, inscription, or text. It was, as far as scholars can determine, invented for the purpose of making Junia a man. The change persisted in biblical translations for 7 centuries. The New International Version of the Bible translated the name as the male Junias as recently as 1984. In 1998, the name was restored to Junia, female, in the standard critical Greek text used for biblical translation. 7 centuries, a name changed in translation to remove a woman from the apostolic record. And it almost worked. What do you do with that? 2 verses before Paul greets Junia, he introduces Phoebe. He calls her a diakonos, the same Greek word translated as deacon or minister every time it refers to a man in the New Testament. When it refers to Phoebe, many translations render it servant. He also calls her a prostatus, a Greek word meaning leader, patron, or person of authority, a word used in the ancient world to describe someone who presides over others. Phoebe is believed by most scholars to have been the person who physically carried Paul's letter to the Romans from Corinth to Rome, which in the ancient world meant she was also likely responsible for reading it aloud to the Roman congregation and explaining its meaning, as was standard practice. In other words, the person who first delivered, read, and interpreted the most theologically significant letter in the New Testament to its first audience was, in all probability, a woman. Her title in that same letter, diakonos, was translated as servant for centuries. The same word, different translation, because of the gender of the person it was describing. Every major religion that has a founding moment has a version of this story. Khadija bint Khuwaylid was the first Muslim, not the second, not a prominent early follower. The first person on earth to accept Islam was a woman, the wife of Muhammad, a successful, independent businesswoman who employed him before they married, who proposed to him, who comforted him when he received his first revelation and told him he was shaking in fear. She told him he was a prophet before he believed it himself. She was his only wife for 25 years, during which time he took no other wives. She funded the earliest Muslim community from her own wealth. She died before the religion had spread beyond a small circle. Islam, as it exists today, carried to billions of people, began with a woman's conviction that her husband was telling the truth. After her death, the tradition gradually shifted toward emphasizing the later period of Muhammad's life, the battles, the governance, the larger marriages. Khadija remains honored in Islamic tradition, but the scale of her foundational role is not always the first thing a new Muslim is taught. The first Muslim was a wealthy, independent woman who employed the Prophet, proposed to him, and funded his religion. How does that compare to how Islam is typically introduced? There is a pattern across all of these stories. It is not that women were absent from the founding moments of the world's major religions. The texts themselves, the oldest documents, record them there. The pattern is what happens in the generation after the founding. As each religion moves from movement to institution, as it develops hierarchy, authority structures, and formal mechanisms for transmitting and enforcing doctrine, the women who were present at the beginning are progressively written into smaller roles. Sometimes they are not removed entirely. Sometimes they are simply repositioned. The leader becomes the follower. The apostle becomes the servant. The first witness becomes the repentant sinner. The woman who funded the religion becomes the devoted wife. The role is acknowledged. The authority is quietly extracted from it. Here's the question I keep returning to. Is this pattern evidence of deliberate suppression? Or is it what always happens when any movement becomes an institution? Power consolidates. Hierarchies form. The people at the margins of power get written toward the margins of the record. Does it matter whether it was deliberate? I don't have a clean answer to that. But I think it is the right question. None of what we covered today requires you to abandon your faith or conclude that your tradition has been dishonest with you. Most of the people who made these translation choices, who preached these sermons, who wrote these histories, were not sitting in rooms planning the erasure of women from the religious record. They were people of their time, shaped by the assumptions of their world, making decisions that seemed natural and obvious to them. That is in some ways more sobering than deliberate conspiracy. It means the distortion did not require bad intent. It just required everyone to keep doing what had always been done. The women we covered today, Mary Magdalene, Junia, Phoebe, Kiedija, Mahapajapati, their names are still in the oldest texts. The evidence of their roles is still there for anyone who looks. That is the thing about erasing someone from a record. If the record is old enough, and careful enough, and enough people copied it faithfully enough, the erasure leaves marks, and the marks are readable. We have been reading them today. Next time, we go further back. Before the written record, before the canon, before the institution. To the oldest question in human history, why did people start believing in anything at all? The answer is older than any of the religions we have covered. And stranger, this is Faith Untold. See you then.